As we begin to move into a second Easter under the shadow of the coronavirus, we find ourselves continuing to be restricted, having to limit our aspirations and tailor our expectations as the news about the ebb and flow of infections continues. People of faith may be familiar with resignation, with letting go, with accepting what seems to be God's will in the arrival of what is not resistible. Others find their confidence and their prayer to be somewhat shaken, having to draw more deeply on their own reserves just to keep going. Those of us who profess to be inspired by a spirituality that encourages us to seek God in all things may wonder if we have not been dealt a hand that is somewhat wrong or difficult for us, leaving us to wonder what God is up to. There are those who are content to wait it out and look forward to meeting God, to celebrating the Spirit in a future promised land of restored freedoms and ordinary vigilance. Perhaps as we arrive at this Easter season, after a prolonged Lenten experience, after what seems like months of wandering in the desert, we find ourselves to be slowed down, diminished, and reluctantly used to restrictions. But this doesn't mean that Easter too has to have less colour or promise. Easter arrives inviting us to recognise how we're all the more in need of hope, encouragement, and life, even as we find ourselves to be cautious, doubtful, and careful. It may be helpful for us to remember that Easter is, first and last, the work of God. It is more than one date on the calendar, more than a one-size-fits-all feast. Easter is not a mood that we can push ourselves into, or an attitude that we can pretend. Easter is a call to a deeper conversion, which begins in the humility of our knowing our need. Like Jesus, with Jesus, we cry out from the heart, my God, where are you in all of this?" Like Jesus, and with Jesus, we keep our eyes set on the destination which has always been before us, and we keep our eyes open to the needs of those around us. Our trust in God is not some contractual exchange or our approval of what God is doing. Our trust and our faith become evident in our desire each day to seek what is still beyond our sight. Our resistance to settling for our own comfort or for what seems reasonable to us. As we have walked with Jesus through Holy Week and kept our eyes on Him, we will have learnt again how easy it is to turn away. And as we now find ourselves less sure of ourselves, we can identify more easily, perhaps, with the frailty of the disciples, with the fickleness and uncertainty of the crowd. We can't readily dismiss or look down on the apostles who fled the scene, or criticize Peter, who disclaimed any knowledge of the one whose call had changed his life. We too are a little less confident, perhaps, that Easter will follow Holy Week. Like the disciples, we ask, how can this be? It may be that this Easter, we may be helped by putting ourselves again among the group of disciples, by recognizing their difficulties, identifying with their questions, and seeing again how their feelings resonate with ours. Then Easter may find us not suddenly laughing in the sun or enjoying full freedom, but recognizing the uncertainties of the past and gradually coming to know what it is to live in a new way. In their years of following Jesus, the disciples had gradually let go of the idea that everything would change, that they would find themselves at the center of a new earthly kingdom. Their discussions about who was to be the greatest, about who might be rewarded by Jesus, their desire to avoid difficulty and rejection had one by one faded away in the presence of Jesus. Even though their mistaken ideals had diminished, they were not ready for the full truth of Jesus' words. Neither are we. As we live this Easter with its restrictions, we may seem to be like the disciples, to be cabined, cribbed, confined, or bound in by doubts, or like Macbeth. We can be helped by remaining in dialogue with those who gathered in the upper room. The locked doors and the forbidding circumstances weren't enough to prevent Jesus being present to them. If they were present in the upper room, they received his greeting, "Peace be with you." If we have not settled for a more timid Easter, or are not distracted by what confounds us, our prayer can be waiting for the same word of God. Peace be with you. Considering the disciples gathered in the upper room, we may find ourselves again able to relate to them, invited into that space with them, seeking to recognize Jesus even among the fragmented hopes strewn around. Many of the characteristics and attitudes that would have been found among the disciples can be found in us. They felt bereft as Jesus wasn't present to them in the familiar way. They were afraid of what lay outside the door. They were unsure about just who to trust. They wondered about what lay ahead. After many years of traveling in the company of this charismatic leader, coming to know his ways and his words, learning how he invited them into his heart and into his relationship with God, they now find themselves without the certainty and clear identity he had given them. A strong link between us and the disciples in the upper room is sometimes easily forgotten. We may sometimes feel that we might have acted differently, but in this aspect we may recognize ourselves. They told the story. They told the story about what had happened in their past. They recalled what had happened in better days. They looked back and they shared the details, and sometimes coming to a deeper appreciation and understanding of what God had been doing when Jesus was in their everyday presence. We know the stories because they told them, and they drew strength from them, and they encourage us to do the same. We tell our own stories as we hear the gospel again, and as we appreciate that the story meets ours now. The story that has come generation after generation seeks to meet the story that we tell of ourselves and help us to see how the gospel is coming to life in our time. We consider our own stories, and as we recall life before the pandemic, we may appreciate again the gifts, the relationships, the ordinary blessings that only now seem remarkable. Like the disciples who went to Emmaus and trudged with heavy hearts, they had all of the daily details, the knowledge, the statistics, the reports, and the data. What they were missing was the inspiration, the breath of life that Jesus brought. As we look forward to getting out of lockdown, it might be helpful for us to compare our notes of hardship with the voice of Jesus. To listen instead and to recognize where we have found life and to consider how we might share good news. Instead of, like the disciples on the road, simply exchanging the usual data, we remember who seeks our presence, who comes in through our locked doors and wants to speak to our hearts to bring us hope and joy. The disciples in their lockdown often had narrow horizons. They thought of themselves and they were often unsettled by their experience. But each time Jesus meets them, he lifts their hearts and he encourages them to pay attention to one another and to a wider world. We might be encouraged by recognizing how each time we reach out to others by getting in contact with them in any way, we are not settling for the locked door, but we are allowing the Spirit of Jesus to be active in us now, to be Easter in us. It's a different shape from the Easters of the past, but the Spirit of God is at work, awaiting recognition. For the disciples in their lockdown, good news did not always arrive on the official channels. They needed imagination, humility, and trust to see again the unexpected news from surprising sources. This Easter brings us a timely reminder to be careful of the perceptions that we have, of the judgments that we are making, of what it is we might be settling for. Jesus, who often has said to us, "Pay attention to what you hear," surely wants to attract our attention and invites us to recognize the presence and movement of the good Spirit that brings us hope, affirmation, and life. We might look again this Easter to see what words, what messages, what images we make room for and hold on to, what it is that we share with others, and look again to see how life-giving it is to us and to them. The message of Easter is always spoken to people in their situation, in bewilderment, in confusion, in bereavement, in uncertainty. The message of Easter doesn't promise to remove all those conditions, but brings a reminder and a reassurance not to look only outside ourselves for change, but to be attentive and to have reverence for the dispositions, the attitudes, the choices, and the stories that we tell ourselves and share with others. So this may not be an Easter of parades and proclamation, of evident witnessing and exuberant joy, but it may be closer to that first Easter when Jesus came into that locked room with compassion. His compassion was for his friends, for those whose hopes he had raised and encouraged, and now wanted to raise those same hopes and bring encouragement again. Jesus didn't deny the difficulties of the world. He hadn't turned away from the difficulties of Holy Week. But he invited them, as he invites us, to be ready to go to the world with hope and with joy. Even in lockdown, may you realize how God is present, seeking your good, to bring you hope and encouragement this Easter.